Hello everybody, and welcome to Mountain Computers. Today we're going to be taking a look at a Compaq Deskpro. This Compaq Deskpro features a second-generation Pentium processor from Intel Corporation. And I bought it on an eBay listing, which I won, would have been about a year ago now, I suppose. And I've been using it to do vintage computery things, which I guess we'll get into later in the video. You'll notice that I have somewhat era-appropriate accessories decked out on it, except for the gateway monitor, flat screen, or semi-flat screen. It's still fairly thick for an LCD monitor, but nonetheless isn't quite era-appropriate, as you would typically have expected to see a CRT on one of these machines, which is partially why it's laid out to be so dang deep from the angle that you're looking at it. It is an enormous machine. The gateway monitor, though, is one that I got for free, trash picked from the university which I used to attend, and a friend told me that it was sitting around free, so we went over and picked it up, and I've had it ever since. And some of you who have been on the channel for a little while no doubt will recognize it from some past videos. But other than that, we're going to talk about some of those peripherals today and take a somewhat deep dive on the actual machine itself. So why don't we go ahead and look at the machine itself first. We'll roll the intro, and then I will get right into that. See you guys in a second.
You're watching Mountain Computers.
Alright, starting on the front of the system here, you'll notice, starting left to right, the Compaq Deskpro logo here, some vents here which I don't believe are necessarily built for use with conducting air through the system, but rather as an output hole for the built-in speaker that this system features, something that was particularly unique for these Compaq machines, as far as I'm aware, as the built-in speaker is not just a standard PC speaker compatible type of device, but rather features full audio, like that you would find for proper CD playback, or whatever it is, 44,100 kilohertz type audio. I don't know if it necessarily goes up to that sampling frequency exactly, but it is a quote-unquote proper audio solution, as opposed to the PC speaker that you would see built into most other systems. It is fairly loud, but not necessarily very deep in its response. It does not have a flat curve. The bass and treble are a little bit lacking, and it's very strong in the mid-range, but it is particularly exceptional compared to any other built-in speaker in one of these types of machines, in my experience anyway. Moving along, you'll see a very large unused area, and then once you move over here, a Pentium 2 sticker, which I suppose I could zoom in on here to give you guys a little bit better idea of what that looks like. I can't get my camera to move down quite that far. There we go. Alright, you'll see it's a little bit damaged. It came to me like that, unfortunately, but no big deal. Moving over, you'll notice there is a 3.5-inch floppy disk drive there. That is a double-sided, double-density drive. I think that goes up to 2.88 megabytes unformatted. And then depending on the format of the particular floppy disk in question, it goes down somewhat from there. It is a double-sided, double-density drive for 3.5-inch floppies anyway, regardless. So, moving on from that, next thing down you'll notice is a Sony up to 32x CD-ROM drive. In fact, that might actually be a CD writable. Yes, is capable of writing to and reading from rewritable CDs. So this is a much newer, or at least relatively much newer, CD-ROM drive than you would have seen in this actual Compaq Deskpro. This is a replacement which I found in a thrift store and swapped out the original drive for. When it comes to CD drives, I really don't think that there is much reason for you to try to go old school with them and go with the slower ones. Going with a faster one is just nicer when you're trying to pull data off on optical media, which fortunately for this machine is not the only way that I can transfer data, but it is, or was, the only way for some time, and it remains to be a relatively efficient way to do it, I guess, albeit noisy, and I'll get to the other solution that I have for transferring data to this machine in a few minutes once we flip around to the back. You'll notice another 5¼ inch bay here with a slot cover that is particularly fussy about being knocked out, and I have to consistently, anytime I seem to have to move the system around, pop back into place. It's been sort of frustrating, but at least I have one and it's not sitting there just open-faced. That would bother me quite a bit. Next you'll see a power button here, and then a hard drive activity light, and I can't seem to remember what this light bulb is for. Might be a turbo mode, but there is no turbo button, so you would have to enable it in software somehow. I can't seem to remember. It might be a power indicator light. You know what? It is a power indicator light. I'm very used to, in this day and age, seeing power buttons that have the LED built into them. Of course, this system wouldn't have had that. This is a power indicator light. Alright, let's move around to the back of the machine, and I will talk to you guys in a second. Okay, here we are on the back side of the system. I think at this point it's a decent idea for me to note that Compaq sold this machine very much as a business class style machine, and some of the features that you'll find on here, you'll notice, are geared much more towards entertainment than business, which leads me to believe that Compaq was trying to edge into the consumer space a little bit more with this machine. They had consumer class machines, but tried to make this a more friendly machine for consumers at this point. I have no proof to back that up. It's just a conjecture. But yeah, so going from left to right here on the back of the machine, you'll notice a fan for the power supply, which no doubt has to push a fair decent amount of power through this class of a system in order to have it be working at proper efficiency without causing system failures. It was at this point that we were beginning to see machines have built-in fans and cooling built into the case to help make sure that components inside were cooled. Prior to this, if you had a Pentium 1 system, many Pentium 1 systems were not sold with fans in the system, only with a little bit of a heat sink on the processor, and typically not many heat sinks, if any, anywhere else in the system. And a lot of the time power supplies may not have had fans in them either, but clearly you'll notice this power supply does have a fan in it, and previous generation power supplies may have had fans in them for a little while, but it wasn't typical by any means for you to have other fans in the system at this point in time. And well, with slightly older machines, and I think when we open this one up you'll find that the CPU does have a fan on it, if I remember right. We'll get to that though. The Pentium 2 was one of the first machines, I think, where it really became necessary for you to have a fan on your system's CPU. And continuing on from there, the problem would be worse and worse with the Pentium 3 and then the subsequent Pentium 4, until Intel would eventually update their architecture to be a less long pipeline for execution, which required less clock speeds for better efficiency in the processor, and altogether just lowered the power draw of the CPU and therefore the heat output immensely. It was a very good move by Intel from the Pentium 4 to the Core era processors to revise their architecture a little bit. All that said, not much of that has anything to do with this system, because the Pentium 2 was still predating quite a bit of that stuff by a little bit. But moving on from the fan, you'll notice here there's a 115 and a 200 and, what's that say, 260, 250, I don't know, euro unit voltage very well off the top of my head. A 120 and a 240 volt essentially for nominal voltages anyway. Voltage selector switch, which will allow the power supply in this system to either run off of European power or our American power, which is of course what I'm using here, which is why the switch is put into the 115 volt mode. Up from there you'll find the power connector. It's just a standard PC power connector. Okay, up here you'll find a non-standard card, one which I have installed myself. I believe that the card was marketed as an IDE controller card, but I wanted it for the other expansion port options which it offers, which you'll see on the back here and here. One of these is not actually the card, it's just a bracket which attaches to the card and then goes into the back slots here. And then the actual card itself sits on the opposing slot. You'll notice here that we have 4 ports. In the upper right is a 9-pin, if I'm not mistaken my counting, serial connector. To the left of that, a parallel port connector, whose pin numbers I can't remember at this port, but which you would typically use to have connected a printer at that point in time. There were some other devices, like sound devices, that maybe you would have used, but not with this particular machine, as it has a much more sophisticated inbuilt sound solution. Regardless of that, moving down to the lower left here is a 25-pin, I'm sort of guessing again there at my counting, but I believe 25-pin serial port for the larger connection serial port devices where you would need multiple serial channels for communication. Moving over to the right of that is a game pad or a joystick port. I do have one such device connected to this machine, which we'll take a look at in a little bit. Moving down from there is a blank slot and then an Ethernet card, a card which I have never used in this system on account of the fact that I would not want to connect this to my network in this era. That would just become a vulnerability on my network that I wouldn't really want to have sitting there. Some of you may have thought that the data transfer method, which I had selected before, would have been to send data over TCP or UDP packets on a an IP stack over my network, but that's not the case actually, because if we move down here you'll notice this system has USB 1.1 albeit, and therefore a rather slow USB connection, but nonetheless USB. The device drivers for mass storage are not built into Windows 98 by default, however, and they were something that I had to add over a CD which I had to burn off of my regular machine and then, move over to this device in order to be able to use USB mass storage for regular flash drives. But before I had those installed, I did go ahead and plug some other devices into these ports before I had more era-appropriate peripherals. So I have tried keyboards and mice on these USB ports, and those devices, even my Logitech MX Master mouse, worked just fine after plugging them in, the wireless functionality and all, without a problem. So that was a sort of interesting thing, but I guess really there was no reason why it shouldn't have worked, due to the backwards compatibility that is so often built into these kinds of devices, and it's nice to have that, I guess, for a system like this. So yeah, not the fastest speeds for USB transfer though. Many of my flash drives are USB 3.0 speeds, and taking those to write on my regular machine is nice, but then plugging them in here to read from them becomes rather slow if I have to do large data transfer of files. But with the caveat there being that I can't make them too big if I'm going to put them onto the hard drive, because most of my standard flash drives are actually bigger than the hard drive built into this machine. The hard drive inside is 8 gigabytes, and many of my flash drives at this point are 16, or I think my smallest one is 8. And that goes up to a 128 gigabyte flash drive. So that said, while the files that I'm trying to transfer to this machine aren't very large usually, I can't move over like music library to this machine. I don't know why I would want to, but like my music library would fill up 4 times the capacity of this hard drive, or more really. So yeah, it is a incredibly handy feature though, all that said, to have USB on this machine, and I was very happy to have it once I was able to get this machine really up and going. Moving over to the right from there, you'll notice a sound solution, which is fairly particularly sophisticated, I guess, for a machine of this age. On the bottom is a headphone port, and then on the top a microphone port here. And then if I move over here, I believe that this is a line level output and a line level input, so no amplification happening on those particular circuits there, whereas the headphone and microphone port, of course, would have those. Moving to the right from there, on the bottom is a PS2 keyboard port, and on the top a PS2 mouse port. I do use those for the mouse and keyboard which I use. Moving over from there is another parallel port, and then moving over a little bit further we'll find 2 serial ports here, so that brings me up to a total of 3 9-pin serial ports plus a 25-pin serial port on this system, and then 2 parallel ports as well. Keeping those things configured in my BIOS has been rather interesting, but and I'm still not sure that I've necessarily got them correctly configured, but I do have the system at least bootable at this point, and I'll talk a little bit about why I think maybe I'm still having some issues there. But yeah, so moving on from all of those ports, here you'll find a very interesting mounting situation for the graphics card, with this sort of half-height mounting solution that they have here, where there's one slot blank here, which has no card in it. This is a single slot GPU that's installed. And then over here is the VGA card, which I can't remember off the top of my head. I think it might be an ATI Rage Pro 3D card. And as that name would imply, I believe it would have 3D capabilities. Let me check my phone though here, as I believe I have some specifications pulled up, although this does just say slotted AGP version 2C. So that doesn't tell me a whole lot about exactly which graphics card is installed in this system. I'm fairly sure that it is an ATI Rage Pro 3D though, and that is very interesting because it will do primitive 3D graphics using that. And other than that, that is the outside of the machine. Let's get on to the inside next, I think, is what we'll do. I'll see you guys in just a minute. You know what? I figured that I would show on camera how this machine comes apart, because it is very interesting and definitely tripped me up on my first attempts to try to open it up. So I thought it would be worth it to show you guys how this comes apart. It's very weird. And I wouldn't blame any person on their first attempt to just completely miss the plot here. First of all, there is a screw on the back here which needs to come off in order for the top casing to be removed. And then if I step up here and turn the system around, and then hopefully still keep everything in frame on the camera, let me double check that. Definitely not. Let's move it this way a bit. Yeah, that's good. There are 2 tabs on either side. One here, mine in this case is broken, but the concept is still obviously the same. And then one over here need to be pressed in. So 2 tabs, press them in, and then pull forward on the machine with a fair bit of force, and then the whole thing here just slides forward. And then at that point you can lift up the top of the machine, and then this top casing pulls away, and you have the system opened. Other than that one screw that we just took out, I seem to recall that this machine is almost entirely toolless. Very interesting for this time frame, I think, because pretty much everything, to my knowledge, would have required fairly extensive use of a Phillips screwdriver, and in this case, the modularity of this case is fairly good for its time. You'll notice something very weird in the lower left here. These screws, if my camera will focus, there we go. These screws are not holding anything in. Those are extra screws which you can use throughout the system to help keep things pretty much, held down, held in place. Things like the optical drive would require some of those screws to keep it held in place, hard drives, etc. And the fact that they include extras in such a fairly convenient way is pretty cool, I think. It's maybe not as elegant as including some extras in a baggie that you keep around, but in the case where the machine is pretty much all you're going to be bringing home inside of a box, and people don't really want to necessarily have to worry about screws on the inside if they're not even going to be doing anything with it, this is a fairly decent solution, I think, for including extra screws, and even that is not something that you would have found on a machine of this age. Those aforementioned screws in bags that come with your machine's case are a more modern convention of the build-it-yourself PCs. So you won't find any pre-builts, such as what this is. This is a pre-built. Even in the modern age, as far as I'm aware, that have something such as that, and it's rather interesting, I guess. You'll notice there is a vent fan in the front here. Like I had said before, I thought there probably was one, and the vent that was on the front left of the system before, I thought was just for this speaker, but I guess there is a fan also here, so I guess that what would you call that, a port vent, I guess, serves double duty. I guess it acts as both, a port and a vent, a sound port and an air vent for the fan. So yeah, you'll notice other than that, pretty much the same things we saw before. The CD-ROM drive and the, I guess it's not CD-ROM, CD read-write drive, and the floppy drive there, and here on either side you'll notice these clips which were used to hold the front of the machine in place. If I zoom in on the one on the right here, you'll see kind of the way that those are supposed to look, and then if we move over to the one on the left, you'll see that that one is snapped off and is exactly the reason why this side is broken for taking the front of the case off like we just did. But let me reposition the camera and we'll take a look at the inside of this machine in just a second. Alright, I figured for this segment I would go to the Handycam in my hand mode of filming instead of being on the tripod, so that I could get a better look in here at some of the angles that are going to be required to see some of this stuff. You'll notice, if we start here, I guess, this is the ATI, and then you'll see there that it says 3D, and I'm fairly sure that I said before that this was an ATI Rage Pro 3D card. If we turn on our side here, you'll see there it says Rage Pro. Combine that with the 3D which we saw right here, and I think that that together adds up to an ATI Rage Pro 3D. So yeah, that is plugged into the AGP slot here, which, as I mentioned before, I think is a revision 2C slot, and on the back here you'll notice there's a SIM slot, something that you wouldn't see on most other graphics cards, I guess, but you can actually add GPU memory to this graphics card via this slot. I think it has 2 megabytes built in, and adding this on you can get a total of 4 megabytes, if I'm recalling correctly. Yeah, that's what this machine uses for its graphics. If we move over here, you'll notice there are 3 SIM slots here for memory. I think the way that this is configured, I have 256 megabytes of memory, which would have, as far as I'm aware, been a fair amount for the time. One slot is unpopulated. One of the clips on these is broken too, if I recall correctly. I'm not going to try my luck on it right now, but I was able to manage to get the SIM to sit in there correctly enough such that it is recognized, though, and performs correctly. So that's a piece of character for this machine, I guess. We'll call it that. Moving backwards from there, you'll see here is the Pentium 2, if the camera will focus, with MMX. This is a slot-based processor, but you'll notice that Compaq has done something very interesting, and as far as I'm aware, unique thing with the way that they mount this processor. Most of these, if I'm not mistaken, you would find sitting vertically and sticking up a fair bit in the case here, but this one, as you can see, sits flat, parallel to the motherboard, and something that they have done here to engineer that is they have this sort of sliding slot thing where it plugs in the back here, I believe, but very interesting. I don't know if it necessarily affects the performance, but you'll notice there's a fairly beefy heatsink here, especially compared to any heatsink you would have found on any of the other processors previous to this. And then the fan that is on the front of the system blows air directly over that CPU, so I'm fairly sure that this machine stays pretty cool during operation on account of that kind of a cooling assembly, especially on a machine of this era where the cooling wasn't, it was still sort of developing, and I've seen lots of much cheaper solutions on other machines than this. There you can see the speaker, which routes over to this backboard, which I guess is the next very unique thing that Compaq has done with this system. They have a unique sort of interface board back here with, as far as I'm aware, a very proprietary interface there that connects to this planar board back here that has lots of other connectors on it. So if we looked at the graphics card here, we saw the AGP slot, and I don't think that there's actually any other connectors here. There you can see the CMOS battery, the CR2032 battery that holds the BIOS settings in place when the machine is powered off. Yeah, other than that, there's no slots here. I guess you could install a 2-slot height graphics card if you wanted to in that case. Oh, it looks like this one is trying to be one such card. I don't know why it necessarily needs both of those slot covers there for the one card, but maybe someone can tell me in the comments why they've done it that way, or if that's a completely non-standard thing that they've done for this particular build. Anyway, this backplane board here is interesting because it has all of the rest of the expansion for the system. So there's PCI, there I see a 16-bit ISA slot, I believe is what that is. Then another 16-bit ISA slot, 2 slots above, and then, you know, another 2 PCI slots there. So that's a total of 4 PCI slots, or 2 PCI slots and 2 16-bit ISA slots. And I say it that way because if you plug something into this PCI slot, you'll no longer be able to use this 16-bit ISA slot, and vice versa. You'll see that the way that this card sits here... Sorry, I accidentally hit the button on my camera. You'll see that the 16-bit ISA card here actually gets in the way of the PCI card slot here, so you can't have both of those plugged in at the same time. But yeah, you can see here too that this is the IDE adapter card, which I'm using to let me have extra expansion on the back of the machine, particularly for the game port, since there isn't one built in. And then moving down from there, here is the network card, which I basically don't use. But other than that, I mean, the regular parts of the motherboard are, as far as I'm aware, pretty bog standard. I am not experienced enough to necessarily give you any background on exactly what any of these chips are that are on the board. Although if I went and looked them up, I'm sure that I could probably find something out. You're probably not interested in that though, so let's move on along to the other side of this machine. Alright, here we are on the other side of the system. I want to correct a mistake that I made before. This actually isn't an 8GB hard drive, it is a 10GB hard drive. Not much difference in this day and age, although that probably was a pretty significant difference back in the age when this drive would have been made. So it is a Western Digital Caviar drive, and it uses the Enhanced IDE connection standard. I don't know that there's a whole lot more to say on that, except for the fact that I'm wondering about the integrity of this drive, as under some circumstances I have had the system fail to boot and have Windows fairly consistently have some integrity issues when trying to boot up. I haven't noticed them as much lately, but I was sort of wondering if this hard drive was starting to give up the ghost a little bit, but since it's gotten better, I'm not really sure what's going on there. If we move on from there, let's look at the power supply real quick. This is an ATX power supply, not an AT power supply, which Compaq has provided here, it looks like, instead of being branded through a third party, although I'm sure someone else probably manufactured it. I couldn't tell you who. Those of you who are familiar with the differences between the AT and the ATX standard, though, will know that that means that this system does not use a continuous power switch. This is a momentary switch, meaning that the system is capable of using safe shutdown procedures to get the system to shut down without you needing to physically press the power switch to turn it off. On many systems, in fact almost all systems prior to this, especially in that being those systems that would have used AT power supplies instead of ATX, once you told the system to shut down, you would then have a screen pop up after waiting a little bit that says it is now safe to shut your machine off. And then you would press the power button, and that would actually physically disconnect power from the system. Now that is not the case for the way that this system works. In this case, there's actually a setting built into the BIOS which allows you to enable or disable this feature, but you can enable or disable the ability to have this switch be, when you press it, starts turning the machine off and then safely shuts the machine down, or when you're in Windows you press, shut down, and it will actually go through and carry through the whole shutdown procedure to the point where the machine is off. Was a fairly new feature as far as I'm aware at the point when this machine came out, so it was fairly, shall we say, avant-garde for its time, I suppose. Anyway, I actually have it turned to the other behavior though, so that I actually have to press the power switch when the machine turns off, and some of you will say, oh, that's stupid, why would you want to do that? It mostly has to do with the fact that I'm using this machine more as a nostalgia type of experience rather than as a actual a machine to use on a daily basis. And the fact is, the machine that I had growing up would actually ask you to hit the power button, so that's the way that I've configured this machine. As particularly annoying as that may be for some of you, it's a very nostalgic thing for me, and that's the way I have it configured. Anyway, moving back here, there's not a whole lot else to see, just power cords that you know, hook up to this planar board that helps supply power back to the rest of the system on the other side of this wall here, and you know, cables that connect data and power to all of the drives on this side. Back here there's some kind of a case intrusion mechanism, and that, I think, is everything that there is to see here. So why don't I get this put back together and moved out of the way, and then we will take a look at the peripherals that I'm using. Alright, you'll notice as we go through all of these various peripherals that this whole system put together has a fairly decent sampling of many of the big players in the pre-built computer market at this time. Here I have a Dell Quiet Key keyboard. This has Windows keys on each side here. That would have been something that wasn't brand new at the time, but that this keyboard came out anyway, but was something that was fairly new at the time, I guess. It has a number key. Everything is basically just a standard IBM layout, which I like. On the back here you can see the model number is SK1000REW. It is a revision A00 version of this keyboard, and there is a cable routing mechanism up here that lets you have the cable come out either on the left, right, or middle of the keyboard, which is fairly nice for this system, considering I definitely can't have the due to the limited space on this desk, I can't have this coming out of the middle. It definitely has to come out of the side so that I have room to have the system sit on this desk front to back. Alright, let's move on to the next thing. Okay, here we have a Hewlett-Packard mouse. You'll notice that it has a scroll wheel on it, something that would have been fairly new for the time. Both of the keyboard and mouse are PS2, of course, to match the PS2 ports on the system. They're not USB. This is a ball mouse, and let's see if we can glean anything more from looking at this. There's a serial number there, I guess. Model number MS48A for any of those interested. It's just a regular ball mouse, basically. Alright, my camera was getting pretty close to dying, so I had to wait a while for it to charge up, but thanks to my new studio lights, I think we can continue, even though it's getting pretty late into the evening here, and, well, the sun is down. So this is hopefully going to help me be able to make more videos on the channel, having the lights, that is. So that's going to be pretty cool. Moving on to the next peripheral that we're going to take a look at here, though. This is a Microsoft Sidewinder joystick. One unique thing about this particular joystick is that when it's working correctly, it's supposed to give you force feedback. So if I move the joystick this way, it's going to try to push it back in this direction, and vice versa. You'll notice that there's a few buttons up here. There's a directional pad. There are a set of 4 buttons back here. One more button here. And then this, what I assume is a throttle. It's able to achieve the forced feedback because it has a dedicated power supply, which means you do have to have an extra power port around to plug your joystick into, in this case. I have tried to get a game, anything, to recognize that this joystick is plugged in Windows, but I don't think I've ever actually successfully managed to do that, unfortunately. but I do think that Windows recognizes it. Maybe I just need to get a driver for it, or I need to find some games that are more compatible with it, because I haven't been playing with any flight simulator games or anything like that, so that could potentially be my issue there. But yeah, that's all of the peripherals I think that we're going to take a look at. That gateway monitor I've covered in previous videos, so I think we'll skip over it, and then I guess what we'll do next is go ahead and take a look at the different software and games that I have loaded up on the machine, and yeah, some of the stuff that I've been doing on it. So let's move along to that. Alright, I don't really have any screen capture devices or software, unfortunately, to use with this, so I'm just going to have to point my camera at the monitor, but hopefully that doesn't come across too poorly, and hopefully my camera decides to stay in focus. But let's go ahead and get this machine booted up here. And here we come into the Windows desktop. So as you can see, it's a pretty typical installation of Windows 98. There's not a whole lot that's customizable in Windows 98. I mean, you can change colors and things, but I don't usually tend to do that with older operating systems. You have the Windows Start menu in the lower left, and All Programs menu where you do most of your things, and then under the Settings menu here there's a Control panel. And I mean, altogether it's fairly standard stuff as far as the operating system goes. So why don't we look at some of the software that I have, starting with this WinImage software here. As you can see, I don't have a registered copy, but WinImage is a software which allows you to take images of drives, such as floppy disks, and apply those to, or copy from, actual floppy disks or other drives. So if I take some software that I get off of the internet today that's long past its typical usage period, and I wanted to use that on this machine, or more particularly if I want to use it on one of my older machines that only has floppy disk support and does not have any other data transfer methods which would be feasible for me, I will typically take those images, put them on a flash drive, and then put the flash drive into this machine, and then burn the image, or write the image, I suppose. It's not really burning unless it's optical media. Write that image to a floppy disk on this machine for it to then go back further onto my older machines. So it has turned out to be a fairly reliable and a very effective method for doing that. So that's why I have WinImage. Nero Smart Start, which I'm not going to open because it takes a little bit of time, I believe, is some burning software for CDs, and it is what I use when I want to write to CDs using images. And if we start here from the top of the Programs menu, you can see I have the Best of Entertainment pack installed, so that has some fairly classic games, I guess, like Tetris and the Mahjong equivalent, which they call Taipei, Pipe Dream, which is just a game where you rearrange pipes to make a flow happen through a system, several card games, and then Chips Challenge, which is a sort of early platformer, I guess. Moving through here, I think I'm going to do my demo of my programming stuff last. We'll come back to that after I launch Visual Studio. Here I have a copy of Myst installed. I do have the physical media for that, which is required to even play this game. So I picked that up at a thrift store, and I can boot that up whenever I feel like it. Although, as I've experienced, and as was the typical sentiment of the day, Myst is a fairly hard game to comprehend in that it gives you very little guidance on what to do. So I don't play that game very often, and when I do, I seemingly get frustrated somewhat quickly. Here's Nero again. Let's see, QuickTime. Yeah, that's all pretty normal stuff. Internet Explorer. As you would expect, if I open this up, not a whole lot happens since I'm not connected to the internet, but this is a much earlier version of Internet Explorer. I think this is version 5 if I'm not mistaken, and I think version 4 came on Windows 95, but don't quote me on that because I don't know off the top of my head. I guess I could look here in the About page. Oh yeah, Internet Explorer 5, it says it right there. Okay. So, yeah. And you can see there's some interesting buttons here like stop that we don't have on, you know, modern web browsers. I'm not even sure what stop does. I'm assuming it cancels load of a page, but contextually that's sort of something you wouldn't want to do if you already had a page loaded, so having it there all the time doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And vice versa. If you're in the middle of loading a page, usually you don't want to be able to press the refresh button, so those two buttons have been combined into one button in today's modern web browsers. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff here that we usually just use hotkeys for now, like print. I know you can get into a context menu for Chrome, but most people don't. They'll just hit Control-P, or if you're on a Mac, I guess, Command-P. But yeah, a remnant of an older era, I guess, as is pretty much everything on this machine. So it's fun to look at, though. At least I think so. Moving down here, you can see I have some Microsoft Office products, such as Excel, Outlook, PowerPoint, and Word. I think I can go ahead and open up Word here, and you can see that I've definitely changed around many of the parameters for the display routines for Microsoft Word here to make them conform much more closely to modern versions of Microsoft Word. Just so that if I ever do actually get in and use this, which I on occasion decide to do, I can, you know, work in a much less what I would consider to be hostile environment that the standard layout of Microsoft Word would typically have presented you with. And this, I think, is a design pattern which they have updated to that was a rather good thing for them to have moved to. I'm not going to comment on my feelings on the ribbon, as that seems to be a somewhat controversial topic, but I think that this page view was definitely a plus for them to have put out for Microsoft Word once that change was implemented. I think in Microsoft Office 2003 was when they did that. Moving along, you can get to a DOS prompt from here. We will actually boot back into DOS to look at any of the DOS content that I have instead of doing it this way. And then here you can see I have Interplay and Black Isle. Those, of course, being related to Interplay, the game corporation, and then Black Isle Studio, the sector of Interplay which broke off, both of which were responsible for creating games in the Fallout franchise. Interplay created the first Fallout in their special division, and then Black Isle Studios was the section of them that created Fallout 2. Later on, the Black Isle Studios people would completely separate from, or at least many of them, would separate from Interplay and would become the Obsidian Game Studio, which still exists to this day and is making games. They have a new game coming out in, I think, 2020, and for the life of me, I can't remember. The Outer Worlds, that's the name of it. And I am very interested in playing that when it comes out, because it has been purported to be a sort of Fallout New Vegas in space. And any of you who have watched some of my previous videos know that I rather enjoy Fallout New Vegas. So, yeah. I do have Fallouts 1 and 2 on here, so that is something that I get on and play here and there. I don't get a whole lot of time to do it, unfortunately. It really is sort of an investment to even boot this machine up at this point, because of some of the times when it starts to be a little bit unreliable. Although it's holding up pretty well today, and it has been lately for me anyway, so that's all good. Anyhow, I think the next thing that I'll go ahead and do is I will try and show you guys one of the projects that I've been working on here in Visual Studio. It's really just sort of a mucking around more than anything. But if I go ahead and open up... Oh, the camera has decided to go out of focus. It's coming back. Okay, good. If I go ahead and open up... Let's see, I'm gonna have to go just all the way from the C directory, aren't I, to be able to get here. Project files. Is that a folder that I see anywhere here? I think you have to go into Dev Studio, My Projects. There we go. Okay. I'm trying to figure out which one of these it is that I want to show you. I think it's Test Project. I don't think it's Test Project. Test Application, it must be. Here we go. So this whole thing is written in C++ version 1998, which unfortunately doesn't adhere to... let me zoom in a little bit here. Which unfortunately doesn't adhere to all of the modern C++ standards. And that has been sort of a problem for me in doing this project, but as you can see, I've gone through and written some code here. Pretty much everything is in a structure, because even though it is in C++, because some of the class conventions that were in C++ 98 were not the same, not written the same way as they are in modern versions of C++, and I wasn't really able to get them to work correctly. And also, some of the functions are just outright broken, I have found, and just don't adhere to any of the documentation relevant to C++ 98 or otherwise. So all of this stuff that altogether comes out to be, I don't know how many lines this is, I guess, but all handwritten anyway, compiles to become, let me see if I remember the key combination that this version uses. It must not be that. There we go. That is not what I want to do. I must have to do something to get this to run, because I know I will have been running it a lot of the time. Tell you what, guys, I'll get back to you once I've figured out what the issue is. Okay, here we are. I think I have everything opened up that I needed, and as you can see, this is still just the same project we were looking at a minute ago, but yeah, all together there, that compiles to become this. Let me actually center that on the screen so I get less glare. Here we go. Alright. This is a derivative version of a game which I've been programming pretty much since I started learning how to program, called Katana Triangle, offline or online, depending on the context of whether the version has been given functionality to work on a network or not. And in this version, of course, it is offline, but it is a fantasy turn-based fighter, basically. There's not a whole lot of story involved in it, but As you can see, if I go ahead and make a new game here, then I can enter a name, and here's the first bug that I really ran into with C++98. The part of the programming where I wrote this in should allow me to enter in any string of characters, including with spaces, and have to hit the enter key only once in order to take that in as a string, but instead this version makes me hit it twice. I guess it's not too big of a deal, but it's really not optimal for the end user to have to hit their return key twice in order to do something as simple as enter their name. Anyway, from here there's several options. You can get information about your character by pressing 2, and you can see it displays my name, my health, my attack points, and my defense, and the amount of money that I have and the items that I have equipped. And there's a shop where you can buy more things, and probably the biggest attraction, of course, is the fighting interface, where if I go ahead and enter into a fight here, I can try and yeah, do a few fights. There's different kinds of enemies that you can fight. A gargoyle, I believe, is the weakest of them, although I've already lost all of my health points now, so I'll probably lose. Your enemy will either attack or defend based on a random chance, and Grengite is the 3rd hardest out of 5. Back to a Gargolin. Theflora is the 2nd most difficult. I think we saw the Chargion a little bit ago, and that is the most... Here we go. The Chargion is the highest attacker out of everything, but has a somewhat normalized defense, and then the Umbeki, which you see right here, it has the highest defense with a sort of normalized attack stat. So yeah, altogether I've created this game a few times and gotten it fairly balanced on some of the older versions, but I've recreated this so many times at this point that I don't really have a definitive one single copy of it. I will eventually be working with a friend to put out an official version of this game, though, maybe sometime next year. We're working on a different project right now, and it's yet to be seen whether I'll show that project off on the channel or not, but it's a possibility, I guess. It's something that I'll consider. But I think that's everything that I wanted to show off for this game right now, and why don't we go ahead and go back into DOS now. Hopefully I can line this camera up okay to where it doesn't look too odd. I did quite a bit to get it lined up to start with, and then sort of gave up when I realized I would have to zoom in on some stuff. But yeah, so in Windows 98, of course, you can go here to shut down, and there is an option here to restart in MS-DOS mode, which you probably can't see unless I zoom in, so let me do that. Right here, instead of having a restart, shutdown, or standby. Some of you might ask, why isn't this in modern versions of Windows? Why can't I go into a text mode version of Windows today? And the answer in that sort of lies in the fact that Microsoft Windows is no longer built on MS-DOS underneath, and hasn't really been since Windows XP, I know, was not, and any version that was built on the NT kernel was not. The NT kernel is the layer underneath of Windows that lets most of Windows's processes run. I hope I'm not misspeaking when I say that, but I'm fairly sure that that is what it does, and MS-DOS is responsible for doing that for older versions of Windows. Versions of Windows which were released at the same time of this that ran the NT kernel, such as Windows NT4, would have been running NT kernel and wouldn't have had this option either if I remember correctly, but this is still MS-DOS based, so we can go ahead and do this. Of course, there's the Windows log-off sound, and that presents us with a C prompt. You'll notice it still says Windows 98, and that is because it is marketed as Windows 98, not as DOS, even though this does still give us a DOS-compatible interface. That was somewhat differentiated in Windows 95, where I believe that there was a version of DOS that came out called DOS 7 that was the underlying framework for Windows 95, but was still a DOS product, separate from Windows 95, even though in Windows 95 it was referred to as the DOS environment for Windows 95. In this case, there is no differentiation that I am aware of. It is just Windows 98's DOS interface. So, you can see here, though, that we're at a C prompt with Windows, so if I change directory to the previous directory in the tree, we'll go back to the regular C prompt, and from there I can type dir to get a directory listing, which will show me all of the folders that are in the current directory. So if we do that, you can see here that I have a few text files and things that aren't really that important, some setup stuff, some autoexec.bat stuff that's responsible for running tasks as Windows opens up, some other pretty regular folders, and then there towards the bottom is Doom software, Doom SW. So I believe that this is the only DOS mode program that I have installed on this machine, but that is indeed Doom. So if I carry the screen down here to the bottom, if we change directory to Doom software, capitalization, by the way, on Windows to this day in the C prompt, and this is carried from legacy versions of Windows and DOS, such as this. Capitalization, that is, I am saying, doesn't matter. You can type in this as that, and Windows really doesn't care. It will still accurately change the directory to Doom software. Something I've always considered a little bit funny, and Linux definitely, and Unix likewise, doesn't do it that way. Linux is very, very case sensitive. Yeah, it's, I don't know, it's something that's always been in Windows, so at least they're consistent, I guess. I don't know. From there, I can type Doom, and typing that will execute the program or file in this directory that has an executable format. So be that a .com file or a .bat file or an exe, as I believe it is in this case, it will run it. And once I do that, you'll notice we start to get some graphics here in a DOS graphics environment, and we have Doom complete with sound. So that's pretty loud. I'm going to have to try and talk a little bit louder here for this section, I think, but if we go ahead and go in here, you'll notice I don't know what my control schema is, but yeah, there we go. I can control the game here, and it runs just fine. There's no music. I don't know why not. I just haven't configured it probably, but yeah, you can see that's a pretty much regular running version of Doom. So yeah, let me go ahead and close out of here. That will close out of that, and then if I type cd ... that'll bring us back. I believe Windows's launch routines are in the path directory, which is a directory a listing of directories for executable software that can be run from anywhere on the system, regardless of what your current folder is. So Windows's executable is denoted as WIN. That is something that started with older versions of Windows, and you can do in Windows 3.1 to start Windows as well, but I think that if I type this, it will send me back into the Windows environment. Alright, it took a little bit of time to get there, but it did eventually do it. So yeah, Windows does start through that by being able to just type win. And the only reason why I didn't shut the machine down right there, which I could have done because the hard drive would have been parked, was just to show you the way that I shut this machine down. So if I go here to shut down in Windows and then hit OK, we'll get the log off sound, and then the machine will carry through to apparently a full system shutdown. I must have rearranged the BIOS to do that. So when I said that it would ask me to manually turn the machine off, I misspoke. And I know that I had reset the BIOS on this machine at some point, and I guess I just didn't reconfigure that. But, oh well, not the end of the world. So, I think, though, guys, that is everything that I have to say about the Compaq Deskpro. So, and let me turn up one of these lights so that you guys can see me a little better. There we go. Alright. Thank you everybody for watching this video on Mountain Computers. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking, or, you know, if you didn't like it, you can go ahead and hit that button too. And if you really liked it though, or want to see some of my other videos in the future, please consider, you know, subscribing to the channel so that you don't miss any of my future content. And yeah, I'll see you guys next time. Bye.